out of the way. So as I was starting to say, is looking at this map, you'll see, if you basically see 91 north and south in the middle. So on the west side of that, you've got the Metacomet, and further down there becomes a V where it becomes a Metabasset, and then they've some other name further down, which I'll get to. On the east side, you've got the Schnipsit Trail, and then further east, you get into the Nipmucks, east and west. And then there's a Pequot Trail down towards the Stonington area. When you go back to the west of the Metacomet, you've got the Tunxus Trail, and then you get further out, you get into the Mohawk Trail, and there's a whole bunch of other small ones. I'm going to cover a whole bunch of these little pieces here and there as we go through, because basically a lot of this is going to be some pictures of the woods as I was going through it over 2¼ years. I did hike and grow up in the woods. I lived in Massachusetts with a little bit of Florida mixed in, but I constantly played with my brother and friends in the woods. So from the time I was about 7, 8 years old, I learned what trails were, and even to recognize deer trails at some points in time. So I was fairly comfortable with it. During high school, my father sent me to summer camp in Maine, which I absolutely hated and didn't want to go at the time. Now I'm glad I did, but I hated swimming. So to get out of as many swimming classes as possible, I went on as many hiking trips as possible. So that's when I really got into hiking more officially. And I actually went through what Maine calls as a junior Maine guide program. So you can get certified after passing a certain number of tests and so on. And supposedly if once you become 18 and an adult, you can pass the full test and then be a true paid Maine guide. It takes most kids 2 years to pass the test. I did pass after the second year. And for my camp alone, there's only one to 3 per year that actually passed. And since they started in the 1920s, there's only been about 25 kids that have, 2,500 that have passed the whole thing. So I feel pretty good about that. But keep in mind, is going back to that picture actually, look at those metal frame backpacks. There was a lot that changed, especially with the gear from hiking when I was a lot younger to where I am now. So there was still a lot for me to learn. I had recently just switched jobs. I had some changes with a volunteering effort that I had with a nonprofit. I had some time on my hands again because I had been running my own business for 15 years and I never had any time. So I went on this short hike. It was only 2 miles. It kicked my butt. I was tired after a measly 2 miles because I'm an IT guy, so I sit on my rear end most of the time. I had crappy gear. I was wearing cotton. I think it was summertime. It was warm enough, so I was wearing shorts, but I had just basic work boots that I would have used to mow the lawn or anything else in the yard. But once I got on the Metacomet and I saw those views near Mount Higbee like that, I was like, wow, I miss this. And then I just kept on hiking. I was like, well, I know where there's some more of the blue signs. Let me do a little bit more. When I started, I had no plan. I was just hiking a little bit. I was just enjoying being in the woods, having some quiet time. When you get away from, that's a really busy trail, the one that I did to begin with. But if you go right across the street and head south towards the backside of, forget the name of the ski resort in Middlefield, you're not going to see much of anybody. It's the quiet area. And you'll get to something like this in Middlefield where you have a beautiful reservoir and views of lemon orchards, et cetera, through the trees. So as I moved around more, I just kept on going further out. And then I finally found the online map on the Blue Trails website. And then I was like, okay, wow, there's a lot to do here. It was very helpful because it shows you where parking spots are available. So I would just do out and backs. And I would be doing 3-4 miles, still with bad gear. Slowly over time, I built up better gear, but that takes a lot of time. But I gained a lot of experience and confidence in myself. I did lose some weight, which was probably mostly water weight, but then I gained muscle weight. So it basically leveled out. One interesting thing is I normally got seasonal tree allergies, mainly in the spring, a little bit in the fall, completely went away. I used to have to take all kinds of medication, don't have to take anything anymore because my body built up natural immunities. And as you can see here, I would do early morning hikes. I would do sunrise hikes. I tend to be in, as I would call it, a first shift hiker. I would rather go in the morning and be done and then have the rest of the day. Some people, depending on their work schedule or life schedule, can't go until later. But I gained, like I said, a lot of experience. Then I got into the winter. This is heading down towards Guilford. It's sort of funny hiking the blue trails in Connecticut because you usually feel pretty comfortable because you're never really that far from hearing traffic. Because some of these trails will just be behind a subdivision, and then all of a sudden you're on trails, but you're 100 yards away and it's a different world. And that's what I really enjoy about hiking on new trails is I like to explore. I like to go to new places and see spots like this in Guilford, just a nice little stream with some log bridges going over. And then as I headed towards the southern terminus of what, at this point, it's called the Menunketuk Trail, which is really just, like I said, Metacomet just keeps on going. This is actually the southern end of what they call the New England Trail. New England Trail continues all the way through the Metacomet. They call it the M&M Trail through Massachusetts. It goes all the way through, then continues on to Mount Monadnock in New Hampshire. So that's the northern end. This was a very cold day. It was probably about single digits and windy in Guilford, and I had the trail to myself. Big surprise. Beautiful view. This is, again, if you look at the hill and past the power lines, that's actually Mount Higbee, just on the other side of the highway. But this is what they call Black Pond in Middlefield. There's actually a really nice parking spot on the north end of this, but this was a nice cold January day. So I just continue to work up and down, depending on mileage I was aiming for and what I had not done yet. What I had actually done early on is I printed a color version of the Blue Trails online map, and I just started taking a highlighter to it as I finished little sections. So that's how I was keeping track. This is actually a really nice spot. Again, this is something right near somebody's house in Middletown. It's called Highland Pond, and you wouldn't even know it's there. It's sort of tucked right off of Route 91, and you would think that there's probably nothing around there, but there's a lot of surprises like that all over Connecticut. And that's what one thing I really did enjoy was the surprises. And then places like this, good old Hubbard Park, where Castle Craig is in Meriden. Usually Meriden gets a pretty bad rap, but when you get towards Berlin and some of the hiking trails there's some really good trap rock hiking trails. And to see the ice formations, I'm not an ice climber, don't want to be, but there are ice climbers that I've seen out there that get into it. Red pine, woodpecker just taken to it, or woodpeckers to do that much work. So all those red shards on the ground are all pieces of bark that the woodpeckers have just decimated that tree looking for bugs. Seen a bunch of those over time. Red pines have been diseased, just like the hemlocks. So a lot of them have died off and therefore become food for insects and so on. Middletown, back on the Metacomet. I think I remember this day pretty well because that was the day I actually crossed a swampy area and I didn't know how stable the ice was, and I got pretty wet. Question? Very well marked. Some areas of the blue trails are a little bit better than others, but for the most part, you usually have a line of sight from the blaze you're at to the next or to the one behind you. I always recommend bringing in a map, either electronically or paper, and I'll get into some of the apps that I use later on. They'll explain what I use to make sure that I don't get lost. Because I've had plenty of times where I had to bushwhack a little bit because I got off trail and didn't realize I'd gotten off trail. But I would say for the most part, they're very well blazed. So continuing on, animals. This was right over in Meriden on the Metacomet. Saw lots of deer, usually running away because they would hear me coming along. Zero bear. Never once saw a bear on trail. One time I saw a bear crossing a state road as I was heading miles further down the road to a trail, but I've never saw or heard a bear on trail. And I'll get into the reason, part of the reason why later. Never seen any moose, though moose are in Connecticut. I've known people that have spotted them in Barkhamsted, so they're not too far from here. One fox, couple porcupine. One porcupine that was sort of hiding in a pile of rocks. That was obviously its den. Another one that was smack in the middle of the trail. I guess they're really bad eyesight, so they don't really, they can hear you, maybe smell you, but they can't really see you very well. So it was just a little one. Just in the middle of the trail, like sort of looking around like, where is this person? So I just bushwhacked a little bit in the trees and around it, and it didn't really care. No raccoons, no coyotes, of course, lots of chipmunks, squirrels, and plenty of snakes, especially in the springtime. The snakes like the trails in the springtime because being cold-blooded, they want, the trails are usually less shaded and they'll get more sunlight and they'll warm up quicker. This is again going back to Hubbard Park, past Castle Craig. Once you get past Castle Craig, the crowds thin out. And then you get over towards the Farmington side where all the satellite towers are and so on. But as you'll see in the next picture, trails are not always as easy as people think Connecticut is. There are some challenges. This is sort of a little gully in between on the other side of Hubbard Park. But you'll see in the next one, if you look carefully in the far right-hand middle corner, there's a blue blaze there. So there's some rock scrambling to do. So that's why I really liked Connecticut, as it was a training ground for me to get back in shape and build up my footwork as I was improving my gear before I got into the bigger stuff in Vermont, New Hampshire, et cetera. So it worked very well. But I sort of think of hiking as like life. You never know what's going to happen next. You just sort of have to push forward, deal with whatever you come across, and just keep going. And that's sort of the way I took care of Connecticut, is I just kept going. And nowadays I look for challenges. So I like it when you see rock scrambles like this, and thankfully that was a dry day, because the lichen can be very slippery when it's wet, especially when it's wet. And you can see the pretty nice rock formations. This Kensington's part of Berlin. You really wouldn't think as much that you're going to have scrambles like that, but you can see sort of the stairs leading up that little notch. That was my first 10-mile day. So it was April of next year. So it was almost 8 months before I did a 10-mile day. So I was slowly building up, but I was only going once or twice a week, sometimes maybe only a few times a month. It depended on my schedule and what I had time for. So over time, I got rid of the cotton t-shirts, started to get some synthetic material or wool that was quicker drying. I usually, for newer hikers, I usually recommend wear what you've got. As you build up to it and you need to do more, if you want to do more extreme stuff, then get the better gear. Will it be a deal breaker if you're wearing cotton in Connecticut? Probably not. You might get wet and cold on a winter day, but you'll very likely be home without an issue. Would you want to do that on a 4,000 footer when it's 30 degrees out and 30-mile-an-hour winds? I wouldn't recommend it because it's going to be a little more dangerous just because of the wetness and the cold and the hypothermia possibility. But it takes time. I eventually got an REI membership, which is great because if you're a member, you can return anything up to a year. So you can really test some things out and see how well it works for you. And it's a lot of trial and error. I've gone through different boots, different water systems, different hats. I use buffs now, and it runs the gamut. And it will change throughout the season. What works in the summertime is not necessarily going to work in the wintertime. I always like the bent trees. Supposedly the Indians would use those as trail markers way back when because they could. It was an easy way. Back to continuing on the Metacomet. Keep in mind, it took me almost a year to do the Metacomet, and that's only 60 miles. Love spring in Connecticut because there's only a point of 3 to 4 weeks where the leaves have not popped out on the trees yet, and the undergrowth on the ground has an opportunity to grow really fast, flower, before it gets completely shaded in. So that's when you're going to see the columbine. Amazingly, this is just wedged in this rock, typical brownstone, and doing quite well. And I'm not sure, I think it's lily of the valley there next to it. I'm not the plant expert. The sign I just thought was really funny. That's right around the corner from 50 Cent's mansion in Farmington. So I don't know if that was in any response or maybe the neighbor was sick of too many people driving by checking out somebody's mansion. And then of course a big old black snake there. Big fan of fern fields. Love it when you see you walk around a corner and all of a sudden you've got this field of just ferns. I've got a mini one in my yard, but it's only about 10 feet around. Yep. I haven't gotten knowledgeable enough on mushrooms to know what will not kill me and what is good. I know plenty of people that do though. Fiddleheads, I haven't really seen as many here. I've seen a lot more in the White Mountains, certainly on certain trails, specifically in the spring. Good question. I'm sure there are people that are experts in just mushrooms.
Second,
Yep.
somebody wanted to know, did not hear the question. Why don't you just repeat the question?
Oh, the question was if I've ever foraged for mushrooms or fiddleheads. So I was saying, me personally, I've not. I've admired a lot of mushrooms, and you'll see some photos of mushrooms coming up, but I'm not knowledgeable enough to know what's safe. And I would caution anyone to really make sure you do your homework before you experiment or have somebody that can help you. But a good old Talcott Mountain, I'm hoping I picked a day where it was not too crowded. I think I did. And then moving on to the chasm on I think it's a branch of the Farmington River in Tariffville. Great view from up there. Unfortunately, there was a bunch of camps with the little fires that the teenagers had made, and actually one of those fires had gotten out of hand, and there was a burn area for a small spot, but thankfully it got taken care of. So again, this is June of the following year. I finally made it to the state line. I'd done the southern section of the Metacomet and moved all the way up to the Southwick-Suffield line. So it took me a while. But again, I was in no hurry. I was building up. I was doing low miles to begin with. And I listened to a lot of books. So I've been going through probably 30 to 40 books a year. I do not wear headphones. Some people might want to ding me for that, but I normally listen to it on such a low volume that barely I can hear it. And if anyone approaches, I turn it off. So this is a book I highly recommend. It's funny, I didn't listen to it until well after I was done with the Blue Trails, but it's partly scientific book about explaining how nature is so beneficial to us, psychologically, physically, etc. There's been a lot of studies overseas and in the US to help support that. And this author, Florence Williams, really dives deep into that. So I thought it was an amazing book to reinforce what I had recently relearned over a couple of years of heavy hiking. And I had also listened to books as I was commuting. So even though I was in Middletown, center of the state, I still had to drive a lot long distance, an hour or two, depending on where I was going in the state. So I had lots of time. And there are some of the mushrooms, so I could have no idea whether if these mushrooms are safe or not. Somebody else might be in the room and know exactly what it is, but I have no clue. So this is getting into the Mattabasset over in Durham. Like I said, that sort of that V notch in the trail system, because part of the Mattabasset is to the west and part of it is to the east to connect with the Shinipset. And I was starting to, at this point in time, to build up to some larger hikes. I had done a couple of hikes in Vermont, not 4,000 footers, I believe, at that point in time. And I was building myself up. And let's see, just after this, I'd forgotten to put this. So on August 1st, I did Mount Washington for the first time. And I was tired. And I had a fun one there as I forgot my boots. So I had to wait until REI opened that morning and buy boots and then break in boots on a 8-9 mile hike. So that was entertaining, but did it. It was a good day. I had some great views up there. Again, getting into the flowers, this is in August. And I've seen these flowers in the woods a lot of times. I have no idea what they are. There's probably an app where I can identify flowers.
It's a cardinal flower.
It's cardinal flower. Okay, thank you. You don't have the Latin variation? Okay, thank you. This is, I just thought was really neat, is the power of nature, is that the trees are just growing into the rock and around the rock in places. You would think that the tree would stay separate, but I guess they were so tight that they sort of stuck together. And since I was building up for some harder hikes, I did a little bit more. I went over towards the Appalachian Trail. There are some sections of the, I believe, Mohawk Trail that are old sections of the Appalachian Trail. Appalachian Trail has reroutes every once in a while. I love seeing undercasts, or some people would call it fog. Usually we call it undercast versus an overcast. So that's always beautiful when you can see situations like that. This was a big lesson day for me. It was not a big hike. It was only an 11-mile day, but you can see that vulture on the rock. That vulture was following me for a while because I made the really bad mistake nutrition-wise that day. All I'd had was fresh fruit for breakfast and lunch. I had had 0 protein, and I bonked. I completely hit the wall at about 9 miles, and I hadn't brought any snacks or anything else. which is always a bad mistake. So I basically had to stop and sit every about 100 yards and just rest for the last couple miles. I was very happy when I was done with that hike. The vulture wasn't very happy, but I was very happy. And it wasn't really that hard of a hike. It's Middletown. Middletown's not that hilly, but it was a good lesson for me. And again, good training ground to use Connecticut. Before that could have been a hard lesson if I was 10 miles out in New Hampshire or Maine or someplace like that. That could have been a much more dangerous lesson. Lots of cellar holes. And I've got a lot of pictures, so I'm going to crank through some more of these. So I had actually just the week after this, I did Mount Marcy, which is the highest peak in New York. 14-mile hike, did great. Passed everybody going up on the way up. I was averaging 30-minute miles, which is pretty good. The only person that passed me was somebody who was trail running, and they passed me both ways, no surprise. But the last quarter mile, as I was finishing, I felt a snap in my right calf. I apparently tore a calf muscle and hobbled back to the car. Being in a sit-down job career, my calves naturally shorten. And with a lot of driving to get all the way up to the Adirondacks with the up and down on the brake and gas when traffic sort of balloons up my calf. So nowadays I have to wear straps on both my calves, because as you'll hear later on, I tore the left one about a year later. So this sort of slowed me down for a while. I wasn't doing 15, 20-mile hikes in Connecticut for quite some time. I did find personally for me, as I went to shorter strides, when I did really long strides is when it hurt me more. Did hike a couple times with one of the meetup groups. Mainly this was for a night hike. I had never done a night hike before. I was like, you know, I might want to do that with some other people. So I did. Great people. And this group, I don't believe is functioning anymore. Sort of COVID messed up all the meetup groups because you can't meet up.
They're now part of the AMC group.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, Carol Ann's the leader there. And she's finished the 67 high peaks in New England as well. She's done a lot of hiking, but it was great. But I did that before I went out and did it solo. This is on Concoponset in Deep River, and another from Concoponset. That is a ridiculously tall stone wall, I thought, but that's the way it is. So up to the Shinipset in Summers. This was my first solo night hike. It's a little creepy, but realistically, again, most of the animals want nothing to do with you. If they hear you, they're likely to take off. So yeah, I heard some coyotes in the woods and stuff like that, but I was quite fine. Definitely have to focus more on your footwork and pay attention more, because it's a lot easier to trip even with a headlamp on. More of the Shinipset in East Hampton. Love it when you see things like this. Obviously, we had gotten a little bit of rain, just enough, and then it froze. So that was just a little rock face that was just a glaze ice. Very early morning hike in East Hampton. Actually, that was afternoon. I was the end of the day. Again, another mushroom. I have no idea what it is. Any identifiers out there are welcome to chime in. This, interesting, Glastonbury. This is literally 100 yards from a suburban neighborhood. So I actually had to park near a grassy area on the side of a suburban street, which I, based on the blue trails, said it was okay to park there. So I did. And nobody else was on the trail. And you just see great ice formations like this. I always liked little rock ridges. It was a little bit of a drop off, like 15 feet on each side, but just a fun little ridge. Over Salmon River trails, and that in the blue in the background is actually Lori Giannotti. She works for DEC and runs a lot of the state park system trails. And again, more icy waterfalls. This was interesting. I actually saw my coworkers, Indian coworkers, wanted to go hiking with me. So I took them on a short one. Well, I think maybe 4 or 5 miles, but it ended up being in the 20s. They did fine. They were all much younger than I am, but they've never hiked with me again. So I probably should have picked a warmer day. But I do know that they've gone on a whole bunch of other hikes on their own. But I guess I should have picked a better one, again, by Hubbard Park.
Steve, didn't understand meetup.
So Meetup is, and it's a website and application where whatever hobby you might think of, people get together either in person or virtually. And it could be needlepoint, it could be knitting, it could be quilting, it could be hiking, it could be how to hack a computer, you name it. There are hobbies. So if you haven't heard of it, check out meetup.com and you'll probably find groups. I've led some meetup hikes before and some cleanups of stealth campsites. But I tend to hike solo because it's just easier and I don't have to coordinate time with anyone. So thanks for the question. It was great to even get into more winter hiking, try out the snowshoes. Because if I was going to be up north, then I wanted to be able to have all kinds of year-round experience. This I thought was a great picture. You see on the left, the mouse tracks in the snow. Well, you can see the result on the right. Must have been an owl, I would guess. But I don't know the wing patterns well enough to know if it was an owl or a hawk, depending on day or night. But had never seen somebody actually get nabbed like that. But I didn't see it in person. I just saw the aftermath. Over in Gay City Park, a little bit of snow cover. You can see that there's sort of a trail there and sort of some little cut throughs. Snowy days are usually the ones you've got the trail to yourself. This is Bolton and Vernon area, more on the Shinipsit. Back to Salmon River, I had a little section that I had not done there, so I went back to it. This was actually my first 20-mile day, and this was February of 16. So year and a half to get up to 20-mile days where I felt comfortable. Wouldn't say I wasn't tired, but I kept on just upping the mileage because I figured if I could do a 20-mile day in Connecticut, I could probably easily do a 10 or 15 in New Hampshire. So that's what I was trying to gear up for because you can't always get up to New Hampshire every weekend. Of course, the famous covered bridge in Colchester, if you haven't been there, some of the Shinipsit looks like old railroad bed or roads. And more iciness. It's always nice, and I like the winter season or when the leaves are down because you can see through the trees. You can see these rock formations, which in the summertime, you may not even glimpse this. So that's why sometimes going back on trails is sometimes fun. Not my ideal trail. I know we all do this. All land trusts do, because do you have enough volunteers to do a reroute away from a road that's perfectly fine and there? Unfortunately, there are people that have four-wheelers and they want to test them out, but it doesn't really make for a fun hiking experience. Though it gives you some mud work and how to get around the mud if you need it. So there are some pros and cons to it. Great waterways all over the state. This is moving on to Pequot and Preston. Again, this was the trail. So Some trails are much easier than others, but again, it comes down to that challenge. You're gonna have water challenges. You're gonna have days you get snowed on, rained on, sleeted on. As long as you've got the right gear, you're ready for it and you'll be fine. Love seeing open fields like this too. And that's really the beauty of it is you go around the corner and the scenery completely changes. You walk another 10 steps and all of a sudden you walk into a microclimate where the temperature drops 10 degrees. It's just those fun experiences. And of course, every once in a while, I'll see some horses and cattle nearby. More of Preston. This was absolutely beautiful. There's a bunch of reservoirs over on the Nipmuc Trail in the Mansfield Center area. And you're just hiking along these reservoirs. And you'll get some day hikers out there, some families and dog walkers, etc. But for the most part, if you go, whenever you go, you never know. If it's a weekday, you're gonna have the trails mostly to yourself. And the weekends, it might get a little bit busier. I don't know why I thought this was special. You can see some of the trees were cut down and it's just a nice little drop there. Well, Jerry obviously really liked the view that you'll see next because he got his own bench. But I'm sure Jerry and his family were there many times. And that's the beauty of land trusts and Connecticut Forest and Park is they preserve these places for everybody. So this was Jerry's view. And I can't blame him for wanting to have a bench there. Firm believer in this, you get out what you put in. The way I look at it is the more you do, the more you can do. The less you do, the less you can do. So I was starting this venture when I was in my late 40s and I had been pretty out of shape. So I wanted to do more and more. While I was up on the Nipmuc Trail, I met this very large guy. He was probably about 6'3", 6'4", well into the 250 plus range. I chatted with him for a few minutes and I was really pleased and happy with him. He said he had started hiking only a couple months earlier and he had already lost 30 pounds just because he got out there. He just started walking and he changed some of his habits. And I just encourage anyone that wants to get out there, whatever works for you and gets you started. And whether if it's 2 miles or if it's 15 miles, do what works. My cholesterol has dropped rock bottom. My heart rate is really low. And so I'm in really good shape now. I do like to eat. But hiking is one of my excuses to eat well. Stafford Springs, some on the Notchog Trail. This was part of a little park along the trail. I don't recall I actually saw any beavers. I saw a whole bunch of beaver dams, a bunch of beaver lodges. Never actually saw any beavers. Did see a whole bunch of old mill damming structures along waterways. Being a history guy, I really like that because we used to, in this state and many other states, use water power for as much as we could get out of it. Even if it was just for damming up to make a pond so that you could feed your livestock. If you look through most of the trees in the state, majority of the trees are less than 100 years old. Much of the state was still being actively farmed until the 1920s, 1930s. Connecticut is not good for large agricultural tillable fields, but it's very good, and I'm a reservoir guy, it was very good for fattening livestock. Connecticut was very well known for fattening cattle and pig before they went to market because grass will grow between rocks and the animals will go between the rocks. But it's a very different world now. Yep. Yes, absolutely. And nice big old bog walk. Apparently I was there in a dry season because you can see there's a little bit of wetness, but it wasn't too bad. Back at the Connecticut Mass border at Bigelow Hollow, Bigelow Hollow, if you haven't been to that state park up in Union, highly recommend it. Again, it's a very long reservoir, and there are hiking trails that go all the way around it. Very well frequented up there. This was a cool find for me in the northeast corner. This was on the Nipmuc Trail. Is that this was part of what they call the Connecticut Path. So when Reverend Thomas Hooker and his followers arrived in Hartford in 1634, they took this trail from Boston through Massachusetts and Connecticut to Hartford. I'm a direct descendant of Reverend Thomas Hooker, my mother's side. So this was very cool for me to see this. I had heard about the Connecticut Path because there's an older gentleman that has done a lot of lectures and so on about it, but I was sort of surprised to see the sign here, which I thought was pretty neat. So interesting to see a trail that's almost 400 years old. We do have some old trails in the state. Just a nice waterway. My first stealth camp. I tried to get a reservation at one of the sanctioned shelters, but I don't know as if they were not open yet or if they were all booked with scouts. So I just picked a good spot and I was fine. I was actually only about 100 yards from a couple houses. You could see through the trees, but I kept quiet. Of course, only used a stove. I would never do a campfire. Stoves are much safer and usually recommended for camping and hiking out. Old Furnace in Danielson. So again, more of the eastern part of the state I tried to cover as usually when I started a trail, I continued on that. Again, more great rock formations. Coming back to Middletown, I had a little local hike that I did. Very cool along the Metacomet up on near Mount Higbee and Durham has some of this too, is that you'll have basically these grass meadows that are underneath the tree canopy. And you would think is just like a hayfield, except there are trees in the middle of it. You'll see that here I'm wearing the compression strap around my right calf. Now I have them on both calves and I use them every time I hike. And I've been good between that and a lot of stretching. As you go through your hiking, you're likely to get blisters, you're gonna get sore muscles, you're gonna get scratches, you might trip and fall. I've done a number of Supermans in my time. I actually did a 25-mile hike in the Adirondacks in the summertime. Last couple of miles of it, I was tired. It was a gravelly section, it was flat. And I tripped on a stupid root that was not even attached and I went face first. So got a little bit bloody, got up, kept going. Depends on how much you push yourself. I usually looked at if I got sore and was really working my muscles, then I was making myself grow. So I kept doing it. And I do lots of stretching. Before and after and during hikes. More great waterways. I do like to give back, which is why I'm a member of the Canton Land Trust and I'm a member of the board. I try to help Phil with his IT woes and things like that. I did volunteer a couple times with Forest and Park. I helped them do some trail maintenance. In this case, we built some bog bridges. That on the right-hand side in the blue shirt is Rob Butterworth. He lives in the Deep River area and he's one of the main maintainers for the Concaponsa trails in the state forest down there. So there's the bridges that we built with our handful of crew. I don't even remember where that was. Most of these pictures I was able to identify because of my app trackers. But that one I didn't track because I knew I wasn't like doing a normal hike. I was going to be doing a lot of back and forth in an area. This is moving on to the Mohawk, northwest corner in Cornwall. Always love seeing these little dinosaurs. Red Ents, I believe, or Fs that they're called. I haven't seen many of these the last couple of years, but some seasons I've seen tons of them if you get the right weather in the summertime. Another great fern field. This is Mattatuck Trail in Warren. You're going to learn a new language. There's a whole bunch of specific words that are for hiking. So I'll rattle through some of these. Some of these you probably heard, but through hike, Sobo, Nobo, Bushwhack, Out and Back, Blaze, Water Bar, Bog Walk, Bog Bridge, Rock Hop, Blowdown, Gator, Carnes, Camel, GPS, of course, Herd Path, Hiker Midnight. I tend to do Hiker Midnight, which is usually going to sleep when the sun goes down because you're getting back up when the sun gets up in the morning. And the list goes on. So it's sort of fun learning its own lingo. Southbound and northbound. Usually hear that more with through hikers, like on the Appalachian Trail, because they're usually, majority of ATers are northbounders, which you start in Georgia where it's easier and you work your way up. The diehards do southbounds where they start with the hardest stuff in Maine and New Hampshire and work their way south. And then you'll hear flip-floppers. But that's a whole different discussion getting into the AT. So this over in the Mohawk Trail in Cornwall. This vulture wasn't following me, but apparently I went by their favorite perch. This was again on the Mohawk in Cornwall. Great trail. A little treacherous in areas because I did give blood to the trail after taking this picture because it was dry pine needles on rock slabs. And I slipped and just did a little like couple-inch gouge on my arm, just a surface wound. But you have to be careful. You have to know your footwear and know your sticking quality. It's like I use Hawker trail runners now. Great when they're dry, terrible when it's wet. So you have to understand your conditions and what your shoe wear will help you get away with. More in Cornwall, just the views are just absolutely amazing in places, whether if it's in the trees or above the trees. An old iron furnace, of course, the Iron Trail in Canaan. This is the very beginning of the trail. They've got a little park there and they've got some interpretive markers to explain what was going on there. Okay, thank you. It hadn't looked that much up. It took me a while to identify just the location for all these photos. Just a nice mossy waterway, again on the Iron Trail. A little bit of a fern field again. This is now onto the Tunxus Trail in Barkhamsted. Interesting that the Tunxus Trail is just on the east side of that huge reservoir. And I don't know the name of our reservoir there right off the top of my head, but there's only one view like the entire way of the reservoir. But there are some great woodland hikes. So enjoy that. And sometimes you get some nice waterways. So again, another cellar hole. What's interesting is a lot of the older houses are capes. Capes were the predominantly common house in colonial times. They're the small ones, center chimney. So on one side of the tree or the other was probably the fireplace, the base. The big, huge colonials like you see in centers of towns, those were usually the ones that got preserved, but the little capes are the ones that usually rotted and got destroyed over time. So it's interesting to see a lot of these cellar holes. Another great trail. Sometimes they're just right of ways, so I understand when we have to have roads as trails. And then you can see that this has clearly been a replanted pine because they're all perfectly straight rows. But it's actually sort of cool when they're that straight. This was a good day. I think I did about, I don't know, 18 or so miles. And this is when I first started doing Uber for one ways. So I feel bad for the Uber driver because they got a gross, sweaty hiker. And I was able to get signal and I got a ride back to my car. So since I usually hike solo, I don't have the option of doing a car drop with somebody else. So I did do Ubers. Don't try it in the Northwest or in the Northeast because you're not going to get any Uber. If you're someplace in a more populated area, you shouldn't have too much of a trouble. So this is my variation of the map in Gaia. Well, Gaia is one of the apps I'll cover in a few minutes, but you can see I've covered a lot of Connecticut. Unfortunately, you will see some gaps here because either I never recorded it on an app or the app failed on me and I never had any data for it. I did have one of the apps that failed a lot, which is why I don't use that app anymore. And I'll explain which one that is in a few as we get towards the end. So a lot here just over the Rhode Island border is the north-south trail, which goes actually all the way through Massachusetts as well as the Mid-State Trail. So I'm halfway through the north-south trail in Rhode Island because my other half lives over in Rhode Island and I'll do some hiking while I'm over there. That amazing power of nature. This was over in Macedonia State Park over in Kent. One of my favorite state parks in the state because you go in and you drive where you park in the middle is sort of in the middle of a bowl ridge. And there's a hiking trail you can go around the whole ridgeway. And some of the Appalachian Trail used to be through this park as well. But it's a really fun, rocky, steeper hike if you're looking for more of a challenge. And it just was absolutely beautiful. And you had some great views when you got up on the top of some of the ridgeways. Again, there's some good rock scrambles. If you look very carefully, sort of 2/3 over to the left, you'll see a blue blaze. And a little bit further to the left, further next to one of the rock slabs, you'll see another blaze. So there's some interesting footwork to do here and there in the state. Big fan of fuzzy rocks, where you get fern-covered slabs. Yes, again, some of these intriguing. If you look carefully, there's just above where it says Housatonic Range, you'll see that there's a blue arrow there pointing right in the middle of the rocks. And there's another little bit of a blaze further in. So you actually go through that. So is what some people would call lemon squeeze, because you've got to sort of squeeze your way through there. Sometimes you have to take your packs off, sometimes you don't. It depends on how big your pack is, I guess. Another great waterway, mossy rocks. Really makes me feel good when I see things like this for two reasons. One is the family donated thousands of acres of land to be held in public trust. So it could be appreciated by other people. And you can see that one of the views coming up that they helped to preserve. So this is over in Thomaston on the Mattatuck Trail. Land trusts are a combination of decades, if not centuries, of effort by individuals and lots of volunteers. It takes a long time before, like our land trusts, if you see the map here, it's taken 50 years to accumulate that much land. It takes a long time. But we get to be the recipients of it today, and future people get to be recipients of it tomorrow. You can see the blue blaze on the rock in the middle. Again, this is another little bit of a squeeze through here. This is a Mattatuck and Walcott. Hate seeing this in the woods. I know kids love balloons. We all did as kids. But when these things fly away, they end up somewhere. I didn't share it here, but there is an after picture. I was able to get it down and put it in my pack and threw it in the garbage later on. So just something to keep in mind. This was a beautiful hike. I thought it was going to be an easy one. I thought it was only going to be about a 12-miler. I didn't realize that it was actually two trails together. It was the Aspatuck and the Saugatuck Trail that were one contiguous line. And I was only clicking on one part of it and saw the mileage for that. It ended up being a 25-mile day. I was able to get an Uber at the end, which was good because I was over in Reading. Okay, but again, got to read your maps. And this was after I'd been doing it for, this was going on years. And I still goof once in a while too. My other half likes to tease me once in a while when I think it's going to be a 12-mile hike and it ends up being 15. It's like, sometimes I read it wrong. Sometimes the apps tell me wrong. So it happens. Back on the Mattabasset, I must have just gone up for either cleaning up a chat or I just wanted a local hike, but it was a great fall view. This was beautiful, just a little bit of fog on the waterway in Newtown. The Lilinoa Trail. So just, there's so much to explore in the state. And this is down on the Paugussett. With it. I had already started to use All Trails because my hike would fail so many times. I wanted a backup. All Trails is great for finding new trails or tracking the trails you're going to go on, but they're not as good if you're out as the first one that's recording that area. So they'll still show you the trail, but you sort of have to figure out where you're going to go on your own. Mm-hmm. No, because my phone has GPS, so that covers it. I bring battery backups, especially for longer hikes. I've got a battery backup that'll charge this phone 10 times over, because I have had long hikes in New Hampshire where I've ran out of battery power entirely. That's not a good thing. So yeah, fully GPS. Gaia is what I like the best. Gaia is fantastic. You can do offline preparation or online preparation. You can actually bring up the map, trace where you plan on going, and it will tell you the mileage as well as the elevation gain. So it'll do all that for you. And then what I really like, as you saw on that map a few minutes ago, is it'll show you everything you've done all in one map, which is pretty cool. And even if you've done the same trail multiple times, you can pick different colors and they'll just overlay each other. Google Maps is fantastic for getting to and from trails. I use Waze when I'm on highways and in populated areas, especially because they'll tell me where police are hiding up ahead. But Waze fails when you lose signal. The nice thing about Google Maps is you can download offline maps. So like I have the entire White Mountain region downloaded on my phone. So it will calculate driving directions just with those offline maps, which is great for getting you in and out of places. Peak Bagger is what I use to keep track of all the various peaks. And a peak can just be a local hill. So there's a lot of little hills in Connecticut. But Peak Bagger has been fantastic for that. And there are web versions of these as well. Let's see, going on to a very early morning hike on the Quinnipiac Trail. This is actually going to take me over Sleeping Giant. And this is another reason to bring your maps. Are you confused by that array of blazes? I know there's the top one is a trail, the next two is a left-hand turn, And then there's whatever is the Q trail and the R trail. I would have to look at a map to know what that even would be. And whatever you're comfortable with, either electronic or paper. I was having a discussion with a ranger in the White Mountains a few weeks ago when we were about to do Mount Washington and Mount Monroe. And he was asking if we have maps. And I was like, yeah, right here on my phone. And he's like, yeah, you should really have a paper map. I was like, at some point in time, you have to trust electronics. And I let him know I have battery backup too, and he was comfortable with it. But it was a busy day, and it was going to be a lot of people on trail, so that helps. Again, there are some hard scrambles. If you look at this picture closely, just underneath that pine tree at the top is a blue blaze. So you're climbing that. These are the ones that usually people prefer to climb up versus down, and preferably when it's dry versus when it's wet. This was towards the end of my adventure. This trail better than when you found it, and be ready for anything. So leave no trace has basically expanded that, is really plan ahead, try to camp in the right places, dispose of waste. I usually do what I call LNT plus, is I pick up other people's garbage. Worst case, if it's something sort of nasty, you can always take a Ziploc bag, turn it inside out like you would for dog leave behinds, and still be able to pick up things that you don't want to use your hands for. But I do pick up a lot of garbage. Usually one of my pouches where you'd normally leave a water bottle, that's my trash bag as I'm on trail, because every little bit helps. I will also very often use my trekking poles to flick sticks off trail, or to clear out water drains. If a trail is puddled up and the drain is clearly right there, I'll use my trekking poles to clean out the drain so it's less muddy for the next person.
You cross-country ski and bike also?
I used to bike a long time ago. I did it heavily road biking when I was in my 30s until I had 2 wrecks really bad within a month of each other. I sort of lost my nerve and had seen too many people get hit in bad car accidents. So I stick to my feet. I've cross-country skied a couple times, but I grew up doing some downhill skiing. I haven't cross-country skied in a long time. Some are. It depends on what it is. When you see trails like some of the roadways, that could be a great cross-country trail if we have enough snow. So check the trails. If you, like I said, if you use something like Gaia, you can gauge the elevation change and try to factor on whether it would be good for cross-country skiing or not. So possibilities. Moving along, this was a beautiful sunrise hike, beginning of January. This is a Chog Trail in Plainfield. What was really fun about this hike, it wasn't a very long hike, but I had an owl that kept following me. So as I was going along the trail, the owl would come swooping in and then perch on another tree and just watch me continue on. I don't know if he or she was just curious. Didn't get a picture of him or her, but the owl just kept on following me. I just thought it was a really cool moment when I had the trail to myself. It was icy, so it was a little crunchy, but there really wasn't any snow on the ground. This was a stellar hike. This was on the Narragansett Trail in Voluntown. Coming up to this dam, you're basically following the stream bed for a couple miles. And there was already snow on the ground. and there had not been much of anybody on the trail. So I had to, there wasn't really breaking trail. It was only, you can see there's only a couple inches of snow there, just enough to cover. But it was just a quiet, peaceful day with a trail to myself. And then it just got better because it started snowing. This is, again, another reason why it's really good to have some form of app tracking, because I also use the app to make sure I'm going back the right way, because it's easy to go out, but it may not always be easy to come back, especially if the snow covers your tracks and you don't necessarily, you might not be catching all the blazes. But it was just an absolutely gorgeous day hiking on Narragansett. And then my last day, this was January 15th of 17. Took me 2 years and 4 months to do the 800 plus miles of the Blue Trail system. And it was just such a amazing experience. This was fun because there were a number of sled dog teams, and they were training their sled dogs. So they would have them rigged up to the bikes, and the dogs would pull the bikes, even when there was no snow. So it was just fun because it was just a park there, and I'd never seen anything like that before. I think the most important thing that I want to express is that hiking's for everybody. Everyone's at different levels of ability, different stages, have different goals. It could be a dog walker, it could be parents with kids. I've seen people in their 80s and 90s on the trail. Even in New Hampshire, I've seen 90s plus on the trail. I got completely smoked by an 80-plus-year-old on the trail snowshoeing a couple winters ago. And he and his son just blew past me like I was standing still. So it's just get out there, do what works for you. There are so many trails around. And this is just a Blue Trail system. Canton Land Trust alone, we have what, over 25, 30 miles of trails just in this town. So there's a lot to choose from. A couple other items I just wanted to sort of cover is, since I had an export of my data from Map My Run or Map My Hike, I was able to actually track, okay, the blue line is my mileage per hike. So you can see it was growing and growing, except that gap in the middle just after I tore my first calf muscle. Yeah, it sort of slowed me down for a bit. But so it was a few months, wasn't until February that I got back up to a 20-miler again. So it took me some time to get back up there. And I just really like being outside. I like spending time with friends when I go hiking with them. I'm happy to take people on hikes. I think we've talked about with the Land Trust doing some more guided hikes, which we do. Most important thing, take care of your feet. I wear oversized boots because as you're doing climbs downhill, your boots, your toenails will keep on hitting the front of your boots. And if it does that too much, you're going to lose toenails. So keep your toenails really short. I use Body Glide to help keep my feet dry, because that's the biggest enemy is moisture. If your feet get wet, and if you're worse yet, you use waterproof boots where your feet can't breathe. Feet get wet, they're going to rub. That's when you're going to get blisters and skin tears, etc. And I also use sock liners. Basic sock liners underneath your regular socks, hiking socks, will definitely save your feet. And I've even gone the next step of, I now use the Indingi sock liners, which have the toe separators. So now I don't even get the blisters between the toes, and they have been fantastic. I can do multiple 20 days in a row and have zero issues with my feet. Because everything else is a little bit easier to fix. Everyone's different. I get chafing on my shoulder straps, and I get chafing at the bottom of where my backpack hits. And I use a thing called Leuco tape, which is a really thin, like medical tape. It's very sticky. but because my backpack is rubbing against that, it doesn't rub my skin raw. So that has helped me a lot. So what have I been doing? Phil rattled off a couple. So I think I've been doing a little bit. Finished the Blue Trail system in January of 17. Finished the New England Trail 6 months later. That was up to Mount Monadnock. New Hampshire 4,000 footers. It took me 2 years to do that. Finished in July of 18. I started that in October of 16 by doing what they call presidential traverse, which is you do the whole presidential ridge, which is about a 23 miler, and you do about 10,000 feet of elevation gain in a day. So I started sort of big on that one, but it gives you 8 peaks in one day. And at that point in time, I wasn't planning on doing the 48. I just wanted to do a presidential traverse, so I did. And then I was like, oh, well, I've done 48. There's only 40 more. And I just keep going. So I kept on going. And since I'd done the 48, then you start hearing it's peeling the onion. Then you hear, oh, there's another list. Oh, there's a 67. So 48 plus the rest gives you 67 in New England. So that basically includes a handful in Vermont and the rest are in Maine. So I finished that in May of 20. You'll see I have an unofficial and official. Because of COVID, AMC that keeps the list for the 60s, 48, 67, 100, they basically were saying they're not going to count any peaks during this period of COVID time. And so I did those in May. So I had to redo 6 peaks that I'd done the year before. I redid them this summer. So now I can officially apply and they'll accept it. But they turned down my application and told me why. I was like, even though I followed the state governor's rules, governor of Maine was like, well, state's open, come and visit. And I did, and I hiked solo, but didn't matter. But I got to go back at a different season when there was not snow above 2,500 feet, and they were much easier hikes that way. And then I moved on to the Adirondacks. So I figured since I'd done the rest, the 67, let's move on to the Adirondacks, which will complete the 115. There's 2 in the Catskills and there's 48 in the 46 in the Adirondacks. So I just finished that this last July. I figured since I started with the presidential traverse in the whites, I'll start with the Great Range traverse in the Adirondacks, which is another about 22, 24 miler, but you also knock off 8, 9 peaks in one day. So I did that in one day to start my Adirondack journey and then kept on going. So now I'm working on redlining the White Mountain Guide, which is basically hiking every single trail in the White Mountain Guidebook, which is about 1,400 miles. 2 weeks ago, I hit 33%, so I'm getting there. I figure it'll probably take me another 3 or 4 years, but it's a good excuse to keep going up there. In the meantime, since I'm doing that, well, I'm going to be hitting a lot of the same 48, 4,000 footers again. So I'm doing what they call gridding, which is doing all 48, 4,000 footers each month of the year. So you have to do Mount Washington 12 times. You have to do Mount Musalaki 12 times, etc. So you have to do all 48, 12 times. So that's sort of fun. There's a whole bunch of people that are gridding. And I've done a bunch of the US high peaks. There is a New England Ultra 8, which is a newer list. It's basically a bunch of the really hard traverses like Presidential and Great Range Traverse. I don't include the Great Range on this yet because I had to do a modified version because a person that I was hiking with was antsy on time. So I skipped the last 2, so it's not official, so I'll have to go back and do them again. And the White Mountains have a terrifying 25 list. A mother and son put together a list and did a survey online, said, well, tell us, what do you think are the hardest trails or most treacherous, because they're boulder scrambles or they're rock faces or things like that. So I've done a bunch of those and those are always entertaining. I'm on Instagram. If you want to follow me, I'm Stephen Hiked Peaks. So you'll see a lot of hiking pictures, mostly in New Hampshire now. That's about what I got. Any questions? I always bring a winter puffy jacket as well as a windbreaker, which can be used as an extra shell, wintertime or summertime if the weather gets bad. I always bring a first aid kit. I always bring matches. I bring a pocket knife. I bring an emergency bivvy, which is in the wintertime, I go fuller bore and I bring actually a tent and a full sleeping bag, as well as overnight stove, food, everything. If worst case is I snap a leg and I'm stuck, I can tent it and get into shelter. So I bring all that stuff. Summertime, I even bring a hat, gloves, buffs, because in the whites, the weather can change on a dime. A hike that I was gonna go on like last April, and the wind reports were really gonna be harsh on the higher peaks, like 30, 40 mile an hour winds with gusts even higher. My friend and I decided we were gonna stay lower because there was still snow above like 2,500 feet or so. We stayed lower where there's less wind. Unfortunately, there was a guy in his 50s that did Musalaki and he died of hypothermia and froze to death. And this is in April. So you have to be prepared for anything. And I always, when it's iffy, I always watch the weather reports. I've got apps to watch the weather and there's multiple websites because I don't want to be stuck in bad conditions. In Connecticut, usually don't have as much of that worry, but it's always a good idea to bring extra stuff. Like I said, that experience when I completely bonked because I had not eaten the right food, just having snacks with me would have been a big help. So I always bring the basics. There's, I think, Leave No Trace also has a list of the hiking essentials.
What are buffs?
Buffs are basically, it's sort of like a scarf, but it's a tube and it's a cloth tube and you can wear it as a hat. You can use it as an ear cover. You can use it around your neck. So however, whichever pattern you want to have it in, it's a brand name. So there might be another name for it. It's sort of like a Kleenex thing. It's like, I only know the name Buff because that's the manufacturer. But great, I usually bring a couple of them because in the wintertime or in the summertime, if it gets windy, it's always nice to have.
Where New York meets Massachusetts.
Frizzle? Yes.
And how easy is it to get to that?
I didn't think it was that bad. Depending on the vehicle you have, when you get into, I think it's Washington State Park up there, you can drive closer to the trailhead. But I didn't think it was that bad. I didn't include it in here because it was not a blue trail hike, but that's the only place I've seen rattlesnakes. And they were sunning themselves on some rocks and I didn't see them. Somebody else that was looking for snakes had seen them and was like, hey, by the way, there's a couple of rattlesnakes curled up there warming themselves. I was like, oh, that's nice. And so I kept my distance and kept going, but I got a good picture. Yeah, but Frizzle wasn't that bad. They really are. I think they mostly followed the ridge lines. So I'll go back to it. But you're right. I sort of thought that was funny, but if you look at a topo map of Connecticut, you'll see that basically they're following ridge lines. Unfortunately, as I've noticed over time hiking a lot of these trails is that, and that's the reality of things. Usually donations of land are not prime real estate. They're usually the crap real estate, which is going to be harder to build on, make great hiking trails, but they're not going to be easy to sell as building lots or things like that. Or in the cases like I went through a couple of them where a family just really loved the land and they wanted it to be preserved. So you're going to find a mixed bag of land types. But you are right. The vast majority of these are north-south. Yeah, I did majority day hikes. That one with a tent, I did 40 miles over the 2 days. And my feet were hurting after that one because I was wearing a heavier pack and I hadn't done too much training with pack weight, because it's a little different when you add on another 20, 30 pounds on top of what you're normally carrying.
Someone wants to know if you have a favorite peak.
Do I have a favorite peak? No, every peak at different seasons or trail at different seasons has its own appeal. I basically like them all. Do I like them when they're muddy roads? Not as much, but once you get past the muddy road, there's usually some good qualities, but don't have a specific favorite peak.
Over at the Canton Library, and another person presumably had read it, had very good things to say about it.
Okay, good. I thought it was a phenomenal book, and she used a whole bunch of studies that have been used in Asia, where I guess places in Asia where they, if you need a mental health day, they basically will prescribe you to go out in the woods. Don't see that happening here, but they do in other countries. And I know it, stress level and everything else, just getting out on the trail and having some physical activity, I feel I benefit from. Any other questions?
One person commented that
Sure.
another term for redlining is tracing. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, it's tracing or wandering. There was a big to-do about a year ago. Some people got all up in arms because there is an old, bad, evil banker practice of redlining, where bankers would not sell to minorities in certain areas of a town, and they called that redlining. There's redlining with and without a space. And this is redlining because if you look at the maps for the White Mountain system, the maps, the trails are all red lines. So you are following red lines. So I understand some people use other terminology, and I don't want to be derogatory, but so a good point.
Let me wrap this up. I want everybody to thank, if they clap, we won't hear it. Make up for that.
Thank you. I did hear some clapping online. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. It was fun. It was actually reminiscing for me to go through. I have thousands of pictures, and they're all